This morning we hear a story of Jesus returning to his hometown. And rather than getting a warm welcome, he gets a lot of cynicism. He gets people who are like, isn't this James's brother? I mean, aren't his sisters over here? What's that old saying? An expert lives at least 300 miles away. We have this tendency to think that people who are right here with us can't know much more than we know. What do you think it felt like for him to return to his hometown and basically be rejected, looked down upon? That must have been difficult. That must have been hard to experience that. In fact, it says he could do no deed of power there, except that he's laid his hands on a few sick people and cured them, and he was amazed at their unbelief. It was after this that he sent the disciples out 2 by 2, telling them to take nothing for their journey and to basically trust that God would be in their travels and their journeys. And if they did not receive a warm welcome wherever they went, they were to shake the dust from their feet and keep going. And so what we have here is Jesus being rejected and criticized, and then Jesus teaching the disciples how to handle rejection and criticism. Now, if you're anything like me, as often as not, when I get criticized or encounter a problem or some pushback or some irritation, if somebody does something wrong, if I do something wrong, I have a tendency to get upset. I tend not to be amazed like Jesus was. I am much more likely to get annoyed. And I sometimes even have thoughts like, why does life have to be this way? Does it really have to be this hard? You know? And if I'm not careful, I will start whining and complaining. I'm very sorry to report I'm back on day 4 of my 21-day complaint-free challenge, but I will get there. I mean, who doesn't want a life with no problems, no resistance, no criticism, no pushback, where everyone loves us? No one takes any offense at things that we say or do, and we don't have experiences like Jesus and the disciples are having. Of course, there are some people who try very hard and almost seem to succeed at building a problem-free life with a white picket fence around it, and at least they're good at putting up a face, right? You've heard me say many times before, no one has a problem-free life. Some people are just better at pretending. But there are people who will do anything and everything to avoid any criticism, to avoid any irritation or pushback whatsoever, right? And what is it about life that we feel we just have this innate desire for it to be problem-free, right? Now, question. If a child in childhood is given everything that they want, do good things happen or do bad things happen? Bad things happen, right? If we get everything that we want, it is ultimately not good in the long run, right? And yet, somehow, we get to adulthood, and what we'd really like is to have everything that we want, right? And we wonder why it is that we're not getting everything that we think that we want. In my experience, it is the people who have had the most in the way of trials, grief, problems, challenges, opposition, you name it. They are the most spiritually deep people I know. There is something about walking through times of trial that refine us, that make us deeper, that make us stronger, that teach us that God is in the midst of that, and then when we are weakest, God is strongest. The Apostle Paul found this in his experience of founding early churches. In 2 Corinthians 12, he writes about his experiences of his thorn in the flesh. He says he won't boast about any of the experiences of revelations that he has had, but he will boast of his weaknesses. He says, to keep me from being too elated, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I appealed to the Lord about this, that it would leave me, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. Power is made perfect in weakness. When we are strong, when we are weak, God is strong. Now let's be honest. How many of us actually believe that? No, we tend to believe that when we're strong, right? Not when we're weak, we're strong. And yet, the upside down, mysterious message of the cross is that the one who was crucified is the one who redeems. That the one who looked like the biggest loser turned out to be the biggest winner. It is in meditating on the mystery of the cross that Paul comes to understand this wisdom, and he sums it up by saying, it is when I am weak that I am strong. The 12-step program made this the first step. First, experience powerlessness. Then you can experience power. That is the message. In order that Paul might not become too proud, he comes to this conclusion, he has this thorn as a way of keeping him humble, as a way of keeping him dependent upon God's grace. Paul knew that he was being used by God. He knew that God was using him in magnificent ways. And Paul never lost sight of the fact that he was just an ordinary human being, a sinner saved by grace just like the rest of us. And to ensure that he never lost sight of himself, he saw this thorn as a way of remembering the truth. Now, thousands of commentators over the years have tried to discern what Paul's thorn in the flesh may have been. The most widely accepted theory today, because we're never going to know for sure, is that it was some type of eye condition. But I appreciate the fact that he just calls it a thorn in the flesh, because that allows all of us to identify with whatever it was. It doesn't have to be the same condition Paul had. We all understand what it is to have a thorn in our flesh, right? And Paul had one as well. And if we are honest, we all have thorns that we deal with. If we're really honest, we also know that some of those thorns are in the form of faults that we cannot seem to get over. How many times have I tried to fix this fault in myself, to think that maybe I have made progress, and then to find it expressing itself in a new way, in another way? How many times have I asked God to take this from me? And yet, notice that even though this is not taken from Paul, he doesn't lose faith in God. He allows it to draw him deeper into his relationship with God. He allows it to be a source of strength, to be a way to teach him to depend on God more deeply. It wasn't by taking away the problem, it was by experiencing the problem and finding God in the midst of it that Paul grew deeper and more mature in his faith. Think about every biography of a great person in history that you have ever read. Every single one of them is a story of struggle, is a story of trial, is a story of them being criticized, of being accused of all manner of things, right? That is part of what refines us into the most beautiful souls that God can use. It is in the struggle, the pain, the conflict, the criticism, the rejection, that we experience God in the most powerful ways if we are open to the experience. When we are weak, we can be made strong through the power of the cross. The other choices are to reject God for letting us down, so we think, or to allow our trials to make us bitter. The question is, can we remain open to the grace of God in our weakness and allow God to use it to make us stronger for God's purposes? My grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. If we're honest, if I'm honest, I want to succeed. I want to be right. I want to look good. And I don't want to have problems. Who does? But inside the cauldron of resistance and rejection, inside the conflict and the problems, with people who disagree or even hate or speak ill of us, it is in there that the soul is refined. Gold is purified by fire, is what it says in Scripture, and a phrase oft repeated by the saints. I was thinking about the story of Jim and Elizabeth Elliot. Jim and Elizabeth were missionaries in Ecuador, and when Jim was traveling to a new tribe in Ecuador to share the gospel with them, he was greeted by losing his life at the ends of their spears. And Elizabeth's response to that grief was that 2 years later, she had learned that same local language and went and spent 3 years with that same tribe, sharing with them the message of the good news of Jesus Christ. That is allowing the refiner's fire to carry us deeper and stronger into the grace and the strength of God. Every time that we come to a challenge, it is an opportunity to answer the questions: do you love me, or do you love yourself? Do you love God, or do you love your own perfection and being right? Do you rely upon the grace of God, or do you rely upon your own self? Paul says if he could have only learned this any other way rather than through many trials or weaknesses, he would have. But he has now learned to gladly boast in his weaknesses. Paul boasts gladly because he understands that it is through his weakness Christ's power is made perfect. Jesus, the prophet, is rejected by his own people, his own hometown. And that's often how it works. It is when people revile and reject that a prophet is made stronger. It's just the opposite of what we tend to think. People tried by fire, whose soul is great and deep and wonderful as a result, they are the ones who speak in a prophetic voice. It is in this rejection of Jesus that he finds power to speak wisdom and depth and beauty of the soul. It's an upside-down world in this gospel good news, where the weak are strong, because it is when we are weak that God is powerful. Thanks be to God. Amen.